Yo, Big D back with another episode. Before I bring in the night's special guest, please subscribe, like, and share the Spunky Spectrum Sports YouTube page. Taking a break, yes, from Masters week, but I've already got a couple up, at least one and more on the way. Also, check out the Big D podcast for audio listeners on Spotify and Apple. So, anytime I need a weather answer, I go to one man and one man in particular. That must be my friend Dennis Mickelson. So, Dennis, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to be on with you, Dylan.
Thank you. So, obviously, as many people who are from or living in or temporarily living in Southwest Florida. I don't know the correct terminology with all these snowbirds around here, but Hurricane Ian hit a little more than 6 months ago, and Dennis, as we all found out yesterday, the National Hurricane Center upgraded Hurricane Ian briefly to a Category 5 hurricane before it ultimately hit as a Cat 4 with 150-mile-an-hour winds. So, were you ultimately surprised the Hurricane Center upgraded Ian to a Cat 5?
Not really. When we saw the level of devastation that we had along that Florida coast, sometimes hurricanes, we kind of worry so much about a Cat 3, a Cat 4, a Cat 5. A Cat 3 hurricane moving at a good clip is going to make some devastating damage. Just because it's a Cat 3 is no reason to ever ignore it. But the level of devastation that we saw, it didn't make any sense that it was less than a 5, I guess is the way I would put it. But it was the speed of this storm as well as the size and all of the dynamics that were going around it. It was just an impressive storm to see. And I remember when I told you about things, the first thing I said is I'm worried about this one because it's a very unusual storm the way it was already acting, and that was long before it got up to Florida. So the weirdest thing about hurricanes is they can take on a little life of their own. And as long as they stay over enough open water, they just keep intensifying until they hit landfall. And that development at the end can be really, really impressive.
Yeah, thinking back to Hurricane Ian, every computer model I saw showed Ian was going to become a major Cat 3, Cat 4 hurricane. And then all of a sudden, like that Monday and Tuesday night, Wednesday morning before it hit, it went from like a 3 to a Cat 4, Cat 5, and then I'm like, oh, you kidding me? Because I was in Southwest Florida when Hurricane Charlie hit in 2004, and I was like, I didn't think a stronger Cat 4 hurricane could hit the same area. Well, guess what? Hurricane Ian came around, and not only was it as strong, if not stronger, but it was much, much bigger and moved about a third of what Charlie moved. Because when Charlie bounced off Sanibel, hit Captiva, and then raced to Punta Gorda and Port Charlotte Harbor, it was moving at 20 miles an hour. So,
yeah.
But by the time Ian slowly made its way here, it was towards Southwest Florida. It was moving 6 miles an hour.
Yeah, and the forward speed at the very end, right before it hit land, sort of gets distorted because what the storm does is it keeps filling that eye wall to stay over the ocean. It continues to redevelop and keep itself out over that ocean, and that's what we saw with that one. But what really impressed me was the storm surge from this storm. It was like with the storm speed, being what it was, it acted like a giant squeegee, just moving a lot of ocean right in front of it in an area that probably could take that less well than just about anywhere else along the coast of Florida. The one island there just got totally decimated because it just got overrun completely. And with the slow speed, it got overrun for a long time. It was like the entire cycle of that high tide. You were facing a storm surge that was incredible to go with a bad tide timing, if you will. So it was like the worst of all worlds that could possibly pile up. And that when that happens, it's just you just worry about what you're going to see when the water recedes. And some of those folks real close to the land, that was, or close to the ocean, I should say, and out on the island, they got to see for the first time in many of their lifetimes down in Florida what storm surge is all about, because that is the most devastating part of a hurricane. It's also one of the most difficult parts of the forecast. And what you saw with this storm was classic, where the more it got sampled by the hurricane hunters, the more we dropped instrumentation into the storm itself, the more the hurricane related models, forecast models, could pick up on the little nuances of development, and they started zeroing in on the speed, the strength, and everything a lot better than when you don't have that data. It's just guessing at what a hurricane's going to be, because it's such an abnormal storm, and the hurricane models for the most part are only good for very short range forecasting, because there's so much going on with those storms, versus like the GFS or the NAM model, where they're good out to 10 days, 15 days, 21 days in the case of GFS, on the general trends, but they're not going to nail this storm strength with a hurricane.
Yeah, I mean, because as a native Floridian, I mean, Hurricane Charlie, yeah, it produced some surge, but nowhere near the surge of being. Wilma really wasn't a surge maker unless you were in Collier County. Hurricane Irma, yeah, was a Cat 4 hurricane, and which devastated the Keys. But when it got to Southwest Florida, A, it was already weakening or going through a weakening phase, and B, it went the one half, which didn't produce any surge. Ian basically produced surge everywhere, no matter if you were in North Naples, Staten Island, Times Square, or in Charlotte Harbor. Like I've seen like 10, 15, maybe even higher feet of storm surge. And what my greatest fear isn't any hurricane is for the people who didn't evacuate on the Barrier Islands, because yes, you could potentially in a Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane, you can experience winds 150, 160 miles an hour. Trust me, I know what the people in Panama City and Mexico Beach went through with Hurricane Michael. But we can survive winds that strong. You're not going to survive 160 mile an hour hurricane if you're or in a surge prone area, because if you're 5 feet above sea level and there's a 12-foot storm surge, you've got a problem.
And one thing that this storm did that was very unusual is, typically when a storm is going to be making some landfall like this one did down in Cuba, it usually will not regenerate stronger than what it was when it first encountered land. So this storm did a bunch of things that were very unusual. And but that's the nature of these beasts. They're their own little systems, that their own little world, contained in these hurricanes, And that's what makes them so difficult to forecast. And you can only be off by a very short amount because the devastation with this one was a pretty decent sized path north to south. But it wasn't, if you're off by 40 miles with a hurricane forecast, that's the difference between death and destruction and just damage. And that's why people, when they're in those flood prone areas, especially along the coast, they got to move. If it's going to come anywhere close to you and you're out on the barrier islands, you got to get out. There's just no way. And you can't wait until the last minute, because if you wait too long, you're going to be stuck traveling in these things. And that's when you're vulnerable to the wind as well.
I've got a friend who we walked swing train again around his house, and there was at least a foot, if not more, of storm surge inside his home.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible what these storms are capable of.
So ultimately, why do you think more people do not refuse to evacuate, particularly barrier islands, before a major hurricane? Because everybody says, get out, get out. You can't get out. You're in a mandatory evacuation. The police pull everybody out of that area. The EMS won't respond. The television, weather, all the weather reporters say, get out, get the bleep out of there. But why do people not leave? Do they think that A, I'm safe? Do they think B, the storm's not going to hit here? Or C, if the storm's going to hit here, it's not going to be that bad?
I think it's a combination of a couple of things. One, I will say that in the meteorology business, we might tend to overwarn a little bit.
I was going to say,
yeah,
I think in a few storms, I'm not going to mention which ones, but a few of the meteorologists I've listened to have overworn and said, I can remember what storm was it, Hurricane Ike, where basically if anybody didn't evacuate Galveston, Texas, it was quote certain death.
yeah. And I think when you see the overwarning, you see the over dramatics, and then you don't see anything happen. Because in weather, you're talking, I mean, maybe this is why I love fantasy football so much, Big D, because there's such a relationship between making a weather forecast and making a fantasy football forecast. They're all range of outcomes. Okay. So your range of outcome in a hurricane like this, if you live in an exposed area, the difference is losing your screen door versus losing your life. And it only needs to be the difference of about 20 miles on that track. So I think people who hunker down or they leave or whatever, and then the storm tracks 20 miles away from them and they come back, and it's a hassle to evacuate. You got a lot of things that you got to do to evacuate. You evacuate, you come back and there was no damage, or there was just a screen door pulled off, or a couple of your pool chairs are in the pool or whatever. Something minor like that happens. You don't have that mentality of, oh, I got lucky. You have the mentality of, those weather forecasters, they're always wrong. With a hurricane, even the best hurricane forecasters leave themselves a 40 to 50 mile out on either side of the track, even short term, because these storms can jog, they can do little dipsy doodles, they can run into wind patterns that you're not really even sure are there, that you're just inferring might be there. And you can see this change of motion at the last minute. You can have a big change and miss by 40 miles 36 hours out. Now, I will say with this storm, the National Weather Service Forecast Center, once they got the data and they were about 2 days out. They were pretty darn close to where that storm hit. Intensity, they were light, but the track was fairly good if you know how to grade tracks. Okay, you got to look at this from the standpoint of um, a meteorological hit. And if you're within 40 miles a couple of days out, to me, that is fantastic forecasting. With a hurricane, with a snowstorm in the Midwest, if I'm off by 40 miles, I'm very unhappy with myself on that track 2 days out. But with a hurricane, it's just like dealing with tornadoes this time of the year for us folks up north. If you are in an area of the potential of a tornado warning, you better take cover every single time, even though your chances, if you're in that warning area, the chances of you personally getting hit might be fairly small. But the difference between a miss and a hit is the difference between life and death. And it's the same thing with these hurricanes. That's why if you're inland off the coast a little bit, if storm surge isn't your problem with hurricanes, and you've got a safe building to be in and you can shelter, that's usually the best strategy to go. But if you're on a barrier island, you are just begging for trouble if you don't bug out every time a hurricane's going to come within 50 miles of you.
Well, that's why we live inland, because I'm not living on the coast. The only way I would live somewhere near the water is if basically I made a hurricane-proof house where like first level is like 30 feet, and I'm like, this house is not going away no matter if you get Labor Day hurricane coming over here.
Yeah, my sister lives up the coast. Both of my sisters live up the coast. One is in Ruskin, and she's a lot closer to the bay than my other sister, who's inland a little ways. We had, even with the uncertainty there, we had her bug out and go to the other sister's place. We didn't have them bug out like we did a few years ago with a storm. We had both of the sisters bug out and drive all the way north, and they spent the weekend up in central Illinois. They got way away from that storm and went and visited family. But this was one where they could just stay put, just don't be as close to the coast. And my older sister is in an older building, which is not as stout to stand up to the winds. So 3 days out, we told her, go visit your sister for a couple of days, because this thing is going to be very hard to predict. I think it's going to stay south of you, but I'll sleep a lot better if you're sleeping at Sis's house for a couple of days, because you just don't want to flirt with disaster with these hurricanes. They're just too intense, and that's why they're so dangerous. When you see the path, we see paths from tornadoes, and it might be a mile wide that it takes out a stretch of stuff. With a hurricane, you can be 10, 15 miles, maybe 20 miles north to south with that storm surge with the wrong kind of hurricane. So you need to be on the safer side of things if you're living on the coast. Hey, it's beautiful to live on the coast, but there's a reason we didn't see development in all of the coastal areas until more recent times, when the government was paying for us to repair, because when it was private insurance, they wouldn't insure that property. And now, with help from the government with stuff, we're taking risks that we probably shouldn't. The same thing happened with Katrina down in New Orleans. The main part of New Orleans that had been the old part of New Orleans stayed high and dry. It was the newer sectors where they thought they could outsmart Mother Nature, where the levees went, and those got flooded out. So we sometimes are our own worst enemy by some of the places that we build, because it's once every 20 years, once every 30 years for different parts of Florida. but that one time it hits is going to be serious.
I've got a question. Where does Hurricane Ian rank on the list of worst hurricanes to ever hit Florida? Because you know me, I am a hurricane geek.
Yeah.
I'm not just a sports geek, I'm a hurricane geek. And one of my projects as a youngin was like track all the hurricanes that ever hit Florida. So I did like all the ones even back to the 1800s until like 2004, 2005. But where does Ian rank on the worst hurricanes that have been in Florida? Because I think of the Labor Day hurricane in the Keys, Andrew, of course, South
Yeah.
Miami, the Great Miami Hurricane 26, the 1928, the Forgotten Hurricane Palm Beach.
Yeah, here's the thing with hurricanes is it's sometimes hard to rank the damage because there's been so much more development in Florida since the 1920s.
I can
And
attest because
yeah.
I didn't think TikTok was around in 1926.
But I would say that as far as pure hurricane strength and what it did, what it was able to do over a wider swath of land, I'd say Andrew still gets the nod for me in modern hurricanes. I'm sure there have been some that hit long before Florida was really a popular place to live, but Ian on the dollar figure, I'm sure outdid everything that's ever been because it hit a very nice part of Florida that has had great development in recent years because they've had great development because they've historically not been bothered by hurricanes as much. But we're learning that that is maybe not going to be the case going forward. Hurricanes are cyclical like everything in weather, and they're also very unpredictable. There are certain paths we know they're not likely to take. That's why Tampa's always been pretty safe. Tampa is probably one every 60 years they would have a decent sized hurricane get close enough to cause them major problems. Up in the panhandle, they get them more often than Tampa. And Southwest Florida doesn't get them as often as some parts of Florida would on the East Coast. But when you get the hurricanes, I think they tend to be a lot stronger. You don't get a lot of ordinary hurricanes hitting you there on that side of Florida.
Yeah, we don't get the Cat 1 80 mile. We don't get Hurricane Nicole
No.
on the coast. When we get hurricanes, they're all big.
Yeah, because to get a hurricane up to that spot and to turn to hit that part of the coast, it really takes some special weather patterns where you can't have a lot of shear. To get a major hurricane to hit there, you can't have a lot of shear, and you have to have really weak flow, and that is very rare. That usually you get a frontal boundary that'll come through to about Tampa, which is why they're sort of protected, and that will hit more on the southwest side of Florida. The smaller storms will go to Sanibel Island and point south, or they'll just brush the Keys or do something like that. Whereas these major storms, when you get them, like when you get a storm, it's going to be a major storm because if it's really weak, it's going to stay out, probably wander north and hit the panhandle, or turn south of Sanibel and just clip South Florida. If for this pattern to be happening, and that's why it's so rare, but it's got to be a big storm. And one of the reasons is these big storms sort of turn themselves over time. If the flow is really weak, a storm tends to turn to the right as it gets stronger and stronger. And so it turns to the right of the flow. And in that case, it comes up and gets you. But it's just hurricanes are fascinating because they are so unpredictable. One little change in the atmosphere and the pattern change can be the difference of 150 miles on where it hits along the coast. That's what makes hurricane forecasting so challenging, because as the storm is moving north out of the tropical areas, or it's moving across from Africa towards the east side of Florida, the weather pattern is also changing at that same time. So you've got this big truck of a storm heading towards you, but you got the traffic changing as it comes, and the dynamic pattern, the the dynamic synoptic pattern of the atmosphere is what helps steer these things at the last minute as they move north.
So ultimately, what would happen if a Cat 4, or heaven knows, the Cat 5 hurricane hit Tampa or Miami? Because Miami has been hit by a major storm since 1926, and Tampa since 1921.
There was no reason meteorologically why Andrew chose to miss the bulk of Miami. It could have just as easily hit Miami as it hit Homestead. There was really nothing meteorologically to say that that shouldn't happen someday. Hitting Tampa takes a lot more work. You've got to get a whole lot more unlucky to hit the Tampa St. Pete area with a major storm. I think if they get hit by a storm, they'll get brushed by these 1 to 3s, Cat 1 to Cat 3s. To get a big storm up to Tampa would take a lot of work. But I'm more worried about Miami. They're much more vulnerable, especially since they've continued to expand south. And that means that there's more people in the firing range of a storm that might have missed them 40 years ago than there is right now. So I would say Miami is my biggest fear for a hurricane, because there's nothing from the way they're situated along the coast that is protecting them. It's just dumb luck that they haven't been hit by a really strong storm. Andrew is the classic case, because Andrew could have just as well taken a little jog and gotten, the bulk of Miami Beach. It's that's one town that is overdue, sadly, for a major catastrophe with a hurricane.
I mean, I lived on the East Coast for 3 years, and that place was booming then, and it's booming now. I mean, if Miami ever saw a Cat 5, one that's a little bigger than Andrew with more surge, I think the damage there would be. I don't think the damage would start with a 2. I think it would start with a 3.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that whole area, it used to be, you go south of Daytona Beach, and there were a lot of just smaller towns along the coast. Now it's really built up all the way down along that side of Florida. Those are the areas that are most likely to get hit with a big storm. There's certain parts of the east coast of Florida that are sort of a little protected. The storms, but it's, with a hurricane, you never say never. But the way the storms come at certain parts of South Florida, the east side of Florida, the storms tend to recurve and miss them to, just stay barely off the coast and miss them, or they get you to the south, or in Miami Beach misses them, they usually hit the Keys. So that's the big danger right now, is I think South Florida, Miami Beach, Miami. There's so many people there. There's so much development down that way. That would be my biggest fear with the hurricane season.
All right, Dennis, thanks for hopping on. Hopefully, we don't see any more hurricanes, tornadoes like the ones we saw last week, because I saw the devastation of that deadly tornado in Arkansas, and I'm like, I don't want any more deadly tornadoes or hurricanes for a while, please.
Now, the fantasy professor, my cohort on my Science of Fantasy Football podcast every week, lives just north of Little Rock, and he escaped just barely. So we don't need any more severe weather down that way. And We've of course got our buddy Fantasy Moose out there up near Cedar Rapids, and he was in the firing line the other day with tornadoes as well. So we would like the Midwest to settle down for a while.